welcome to an ICBA cast. I'm Jordan Bateman, VP Communications for the Independent Contractors and Businesses Association, and I am thrilled, like legit over the moon, to be joined by our new Chief Economist, the first one in ICBA's history, the great Jock Finlayson. Jock, you came back for day 2.
I did, and my first day was, I had to commute from the North Shore, but I did come back for a second day. It's not a problem. Yeah, it's great to be here. Looking forward to working with the whole ICBA team in an environment that's very challenging for our members, but also for the broader business community these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start first with British Columbia. And we had the Q1 fiscal report. Finance Minister Katrine Conroy delivered it, and for a government that could not shovel enough billions of dollars out the door with a surplus last year, they're now projecting a $6.7 billion deficit this year. That's already $2.5 billion more than they were planning.
It's pretty eye-catching or jaw-dropping,
Yeah.
and I would also note for your listeners or viewers that it's more than the deficit we incurred at the very bottom of the COVID crisis, right when the economy was tanking. So I think it's a sign of just how fast expenditures have been rising. Obviously, there's $1 billion for fighting wildfires that had to be accommodated, and revenues are starting to weaken, I think, in tandem with a softening economy at home and also a kind of bumpy economy in the global picture. So the deficit, it was surprising, and I think it speaks to some challenges we're going to have in BC over the next few years, because this government is planning on a pretty epic run-up in debt, not only because of the operating deficits, Jordan, but also all the capital spending that's taking place, which isn't actually captured by the deficit figure that you cited. So we're on our way to $100 billion taxpayer-supported debt by 2027, and back in 2017, it was $41 billion.
Yeah. So
that's a doubling, more than a doubling in basically in a decade, which is pretty unprecedented, and is a trend that obviously can't continue long term.
Yeah. What bothers me about that is through the economy recovering quicker than I think they expected, and then through some different calculations of the federal government, they had that massive surplus last year, and they could have created future debt space, or basically saved it for a rainy day by applying it to debt.
Yeah.
But chose not to.
Yeah, and the law in BC used to be that unanticipated surpluses that accumulated at the end of the fiscal year were used to pay down debt, and I guess we've moved away from that. Premier Eby, when he was running for the leadership of the NDP, outlined a fairly bold agenda of promises, most of which had a sizable fiscal price tag attached, and he's kind of delivering on that set of commitments that he made. But the problem is, in doing so, he's, I think, digging us as a province into a little bit of a hole here. It's not catastrophic yet, but the trend line, I think, is pretty worrisome.
Now, back in the 90s, and then coming into the Gordon Campbell era in 2001, the new era, as they used to call it.
I remember the phrase. Yeah.
There was a lot of talk of structural deficit. That the NDP in the 90s had ratcheted up program and staff spending, and it would become very difficult for them to balance. Are we headed down that same path now with staffing increases?
I think so. It's not just staffing increases, it's the hardwiring of the new spending commitments, many of which I think a lot of people would support, like the new pay deal for family doctors, because there's 1 million British Columbians don't have doctors. That's something that has to be remedied, and so the health ministry has come up with a new pay arrangement, which I think makes sense. The premier is very focused on housing, and it looks to me like they're going to spend quite a bit of government money directly on trying to provide rental housing. And although there's a need for it, at the end of the day, the government doesn't have the resources to meet the true demand for housing in BC. We really have to rely on the market for the most part. But yes, I think we are very much on the track right now. Unless the economy performs a heck of a lot better than the government thinks it will, or the rest of us think it will, I think we are on the track potentially for chronic deficits. So that's certainly a concern.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the government projections, in the middle of a housing crisis, as bad as the debt was, or the deficit was, there was a real shocking number buried in the housing starts.
Yes, well, not only in BC, but also in Canada. You've got federal government and the government here in BC very focused on housing. It's like almost a daily preoccupation, both politically and in policy terms. The need is there for sure, We've been underbuilding relative to the population growth we've been experiencing. But the government's own forecast has housing starts going from sort of 47,000 this year, last year, down to basically 40,000 in 2024, and staying there for the next 4 or 5 years. So that doesn't look like any ramping up in housing supply to me. And the national forecasts from banks and others kind of paint a similar picture. So the housing supply side of the market is going in a direction opposite of what a lot of the politicians say they want. So at some point, the chickens are going to come home to roost on that. But
it's kind of astonishing, right? Because during COVID, we saw what could happen when a government was singularly focused on one issue. And all the streams, whether you agreed with every policy or not, work together to deal with that one issue.
Yeah.
Now in housing, you'd think they would do the same, but you have different permits, different regulations being brought in by different ministries. You've done a lot of work on some of the Clean BC commitments.
Yeah.
And all of these things, when it comes to affordability, they seem to be working at cross purposes, and then you see it in the finance documents where they actually take the cold hard look and go, we're probably going to see a reduction in housing starts.
yeah, and by the way, kudos to the Ministry of Finance for having the sort of integrity to come up with forecasts that may not fully accord with what their political masters would wish. But yes, we're told we're in a housing crisis, but we don't see the kind of coordinated response across government and then among different levels of government. I mean, if we were truly in a crisis, you would be essentially aligning every policy arena and area in government with the objective of accelerating supply. And we don't see that. And although the situation is becoming dire enough that could change.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we say there's a crisis, but it's in a sense business as usual with government, which is an odd kind of mix.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any other numbers catch your eye in there?
Well, growth in the economy, and here again, I want to acknowledge the Ministry of Finance forecasters. I think do a pretty good job. They're predicting very weak growth this year, sort of a little over 1% in real gross domestic product, and then less than that next year. So over the 2-year period, assuming we actually escape a recession, which I think we will. But on a per capita basis, we're going to be in a recession. So basically, GDP or income per person in the province, adjusted for inflation, looks like it's going to decline by 4 or 5% over the next 2 years. So that's not a good scenario. No. And it's one that I'm sure is of concern to the people in government, but I didn't really see too much, other than spending more on the public sector side. I don't see kind of a robust agenda to try and turn that around. So that's another, I think, problem that we're going to have to deal with that's, in a sense, confirmed by the data in this new quarterly report.
Yeah. Thanks for the pep talk, Jock. This is great. This has been great.
Well, we got lots of assets to work with,
Yes,
but we're sort of punching below our weight, I think,
that's
in BC and in Canada these days. So.
Well, and speaking of punching below our weight, we should talk briefly about Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. Finally, we've been told that a court decision, the Supreme Court of Canada, will rule on Friday the 13th, probably appropriately Friday the 13th, given where they've been in the past on this issue. But the bottom line is, a regime that the federal government has brought in that has made it much more difficult to bring investment, especially energy investment, to Canada.
It has, and the claim was made, and I was involved in another role in some of the advocacy and lobbying work for the business community around C-69, and we pushed hard for a different approach. In the end, the Trudeau government decided to implement the legislation that we now have, and they claimed at the time this was actually going to speed up decision making. This relates to sort of significant projects, both in the resource economy and in infrastructure industries that get captured by federal environmental assessment regimes. And these, so far, the evidence says that it has not speeded up decision making, if anything, the opposite. And if you read the reports done by global equity analysts and so on, you do see this is fed into an increasingly negative narrative about Canada as a place to deploy capital, especially in the natural resource and infrastructure sectors. So I hope the Supreme Court of Canada comes up with a decision that says Ottawa is overreached, and in a sense is trying to gobble up what historically has been provincial jurisdiction over resource projects within the borders of individual provinces. But I fear the court, based largely on their carbon tax decision, is going to find in favor the Trudeau government, in which case it'll take a change of government, which is up to the voters, of course, before I think we'll see that cracked open. In the meantime, Mr. Trudeau and his ministers are talking about trying to unleash the critical minerals industry in Canada to produce copper and lithium and rare earth elements to support the green transition. But C-69, in my view, is one of the biggest barriers to actually achieving that. So maybe even under the current government, if they're serious about their critical mineral strategy, they will be willing to take a fresh look at this legislation, regardless of how the court rules.
Yeah. Now, when I think about the court case, the ruling coming up, I'm always reminded of Margaret Thatcher's saying that in public policy, no defeat is final, no victory is forever. And that these things change. I do wonder what happens if if you're opposed to resource development and you think that having all the power in the hands of the federal government has been a good thing. What happens when a Pierre Poilievre comes to, or a different stripe of government comes to power and has a different view on resource development that you don't like?
It will remain contentious. Look at what when Prime Minister Harper was in office for almost a decade. He didn't exactly have an easy time advancing large-scale projects, and in a sense, C-69 was designed to undo some of the changes to federal environmental assessment rules that have been put in place under Harper. So we're sort of seesawing back and forth, and it's a real, as an economist, it's concerning about, what does this do to sort of confidence in the country? Confidence is actually the cheapest form of capital you can get in a market economy. And I think we're kind of chipping away at that a bit in Canada, which we really can't afford to do long term. We need to have as much confidence among our business decision makers and investors in what the rules of the game are as possible, because that's really the only way to move ahead. But we've been really, I think, scrambling around, especially the current federal government, to try and, in a sense, meet a whole series of often conflicting kind of objectives. And we've ended up, in my view, on the regulatory side with a mess, and a mess that's not going to help Canada grow our prosperity going forward.
And these two issues tie together, housing and energy, in that we're very much a natural resource economy. We were built on that, and now we're slowly turning into a real estate fueled economy, which I'm not sure any of us are that excited about.
Yeah, and it's not healthy to have so much of the entrepreneurial talent, for example, in Canada, so much of our financial capital tied up in what's basically providing housing for the domestic population. We need to be building industries that can export, goods and services, not just resources. So it's that if you look at the reports from the IMF and Goldman Sachs and other people who take a hard look at Canada objectively, they really highlight, I think, the dangers of this real estate bubble, number one, but also the difficulties that our resource industries are having in serving global demand for the commodities we produce. 55% of everything Canada exports comes out of the ground today. Still. You never hear that statistic articulated by federal cabinet ministers, but it is what it is. By the way, in BC, it's more. And this is, you think about it in the language of David Ricardo, the founder of modern international trade theory, or old-fashioned international trade theory. Our comparative advantage as a country and a province historically has been in natural resource-based products. Now that's changed somewhat, but it's still at the core of what we're good at doing and what the world wants to buy from us. So my goodness, let's figure out a way to create an environment where we can be the best in the world at extracting and processing resources in terms of worker health and safety, environmental standards, but also getting our stuff to market to meet the demand. And we're really falling short on that.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of not personal, but more personal questions, just to introduce you to the
anything will be more personal than what we've been discussing. So,
well, having watched you now for a couple of days up close here, it's obviously only week one for us, but the one thing I'm really amazed by is you are an intensely curious person. Like, you are asking lots of questions. You're investigating things. You're sending me reports that have made me about 3.5% smarter already. So, tell me about, is that sort of I know a lot of things go into being, a great analyst and an economist and all of that. Is curiosity really a key?
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious about the stuff that I've been working with for a long time. My curiosity doesn't necessarily extend to hundreds of other topics, but I am very curious about business, about how the economy works, about how capital flows, what determines that, what motivates people, and in a more intellectual sense, what are the ingredients of economic success for a jurisdiction? What are the things we need to make sure we get right? Because that's the only way we're going to achieve the goal of a prosperous economy that all of our citizens can benefit from. And so I am very curious about everything that touches on that, and a bit concerned that we've kind of gotten off track in Canada in thinking about the economy in those terms. So I'm interested in tax issues, regulation, labor policy, environment, energy transition, future of our kind of resource industries. They're all important to me.
Construction's the business for you.
Construction is
the nexus of many of those.
It's really foundational to really the rest of the economy, as well as being 10% of GDP in its own right. So it's a big sector, and part of the attraction of doing work with ICBA is a chance to kind of do a deeper dive on that.
Now, long weekend coming up. What does Jock Finlayson do to relax?
My wife and we live on the North Shore. We walk along the seawall and up in the hills above where we live. We're having friends over for dinner tonight. We'll see some family later on the weekend. We're not going to do any traveling or anything, but we just, we're elderly citizens, so we don't have the energy of you youngsters. So we spend a little more time at home, and but I keep kind of reading. I don't do a lot of work emails on the weekend.
You shouldn't.
Although if you send me stuff, I might respond.
Okay, good.
Or Chris. But we're trying to get a little bit of leisure time, but nothing very exotic.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well,
sorry about that.
So if you see Jock wandering the seawall, come say hi.
Absolutely. Very open to that.
Awesome. Well, Jock, we are thrilled. Like Chris and I were tickled pink to finally get to this week, because we've been sitting on this secret for a little bit, wanting to tell the world that you were coming, and really appreciate you being here.
Well, it's been
we'll
a
do
great,
more of these, of course.
Great welcome, and from what folks I've met so far, ICBA's got a first-rate team here. So congratulations to you all.
Comms guy's a little iffy, but other than that, the team's pretty strong.
He's high profile.
I'm always in trouble. All right, well, that's it for this ICBA cast. We'll be back next week with another one. I think I'm going to try roping Chris Gardner, the great Chris Gardner.
He's got a lot to say from what I've seen.
He does. There's no one who loves a stat more than Chris.
Yeah, he's kind of a wannabe economist,
I know.
if I put it that way.
So actually, you've touched on something.
Maybe he is really.
That. Maybe he is.
Or a self-taught.
And in a previous life, he was an economist for sure. But thank you for watching, and we will be back next time.